Welcome to Foundations of Social Work. I'm Dr. Karen Rotabi. Today we'll look at Chapter 11, Social Work and Poverty, Homelessness, Unemployment, and Criminal Justice. This is excerpts from your text, Dubois and Miley, Social Work and Empowering Profession. In summary, we'll look at social work's history of working with marginalized groups, poverty and the rate looking backwards and today, the Other America, an important text, common misconceptions across the range of problems, homelessness, just who is homeless, social work and unemployment with limited services, social work and criminal justice. Social work and poverty. The trends in poverty indicate despite a slight reduction in overall poverty rate to 13.5% in 2015, data about income in the U.S. suggests that the trend is greater levels of inequality continues. Income inequality in the U.S. has nearly doubled since the 1950s. Poverty is a violation of the fundamental human rights. Categorically, economic, social, and cultural rights are abused. All persons have the right to a standard of living that include food, clothing, shelter, and medical care in addition to the necessary social services that are needed to support basic needs. Complex intersections of race, gender, and class intensify vulnerability and disproportionate effects on women, children, and racial ethnic minorities. The Other America, an important book by Harrington, focused on the war on poverty, and the Kennedy administration was influenced by the book. Poverty was seen to be defined in terms of those who were denied the minimal level of health, housing, food, and education at our present stage of scientific knowledge specifics as necessary for life as it is now lived in the U.S. This called for a definition of poverty that includes feelings of pessimism and defeat of the person. This is the demoralization of people in poverty, as well as the potential loss to the society members and society itself that results from poverty. Who are the poor? While it's tempting to think of people of color as poor, the reality is that in 2015, 41.2% were non-white, non-Hispanic white. Also, it's tempting to think of poverty as urban. Rural Americans are living in poverty, as many of those in the American South. Another misconception is that large families are poor. It is true that likelihood of falling below the poverty level can occur as family size gets larger, but the reality is many average-sized families are experiencing poverty. And then we have the feminization of poverty. That is, female-headed households are more likely to suffer from poverty, and this is, again, the feminization of poverty. Absolute poverty. This is important. Absolute measures of poverty determine the level of income required for basic essentials. By definition, poverty occurs when incomes fall below this absolute level. Actual income is only part of the picture. A family's standard of living relative to the other community members measures the family's relative deprivation or relative poverty. Relative poverty then refers to the perceptions of being poor in relation to others at the same time and place. Important question. Why are people poor? One attitude blames the individuals for their impoverished situations. That's the undeserving poor, while another way of looking at it is the worthy poor, who are a part of the society that allows for conditions that create poverty. Contrasts are changes in individuals versus changes in society, and this touches upon our structural theories of poverty, which indicate the inadequacies of the institutional fabric create the conditions that produce poverty. Social reform is seen as essential to decreasing poverty. This is important to our worldview as social workers. Service responses to poverty in the Head Start program. This is an example of a program that's long established, dating back to 1965, and part of the Great Society programs. And it has the goal of boosting academic performance of children whose families had fall below the income poverty level. Access to quality early childhood education, this is pre-K, and other services like nutrition and social service combined with this approach. Frequently, social workers serve as a liaison to the program, helping and assisting with programs such as educational opportunities like parenting skills classes and other kinds of engagements that social workers make with families in poverty. The vast majority of children must be living below the poverty level as the focal point, and the Head Start has been successful in terms of its positive influence on participation and family involvement. Again, social workers are an important part of this aspect, family involvement, and this involvement has been identified as key success in the Head Start program. And in fact, Head Start is recognized to be an important way to launch a child for school success and school readiness, including higher rates of graduation of children who participated in the Head Start program. This is an important example of a program that's federally funded and administrated at the local level that has great impact on the individual, family, and society. Social work and homelessness. Now let's look at this aspect of our work with individuals. We have a lack of housing, affordable housing, and poverty coming together, which equals homelessness throughout the United States. There are common misunderstandings about homelessness. Many believe that homeless people have personal troubles like mental illness or drug abuse. We have economic forces that are more likely to put people in homeless situations rather than the personal problems, that is, mental illness and drug abuse. And one may ask which comes first, homelessness or these problems. Poverty and mental illness, substance abuse problems certainly increase the risk for homelessness, but they're not the root causes frequently. The reality is income inequality and lack of affordable housing. Economically stressed families with children account for 37% of the homeless, and ordinary families make up 1/3 of homelessness. Shelters and unemployment or employment. Misunderstanding. Not enough shelter space for those in need in the U.S. True, in every major city in the urban United States, there's not adequate shelter space. There's a misunderstanding, the idea that homeless people are unemployed, but low wages, poverty are a major underlying problem. So there's many people who are homeless that are employed, and this is an often misunderstood problem, that they are working in very low wage situations without affordable housing opportunities. Of those qualifying for housing assistance, this is important, only 25% actually receive it. So this is the federal, state, and local level housing assistance, and that is the reality, is that 75% of homeless people do not receive the kinds of housing assistance that people would assume. This is an important problem for social workers to consider as we interface with the people that are homeless. So how many people are homeless, and what is going on with families? Difficult to determine the full scale of the problem, but we do have point-in-time counts in the local communities, and these are important initiatives in which voluntary groups, including people like social workers and other people that engage with homelessness, go out into the community and make literally counts on a single night as the amount of people living under bridges and tent cities, sleeping on benches, and other ways of recognizing homelessness. And there's a point-in-time count that night. And in 2016, as a result of this kind of count, it was identified that there were 549,000 people that were homeless on a single night in the U.S. And that makes an important point, because this is a single time count, and it's an estimate across the United States. This is not a small undertaking. And many people believe that it's not really a true reflection of the problem at hand, because there are many people who are homeless but are sleeping in cars and other places where they're not counted. 35% of the homeless population, again, is estimated to be families, and that is related to an inability to find affordable housing while one or both parents are working. This is income inequality. And then we know with trauma, mothers who are homeless are more likely to have experienced domestic violence, physical and sexual abuse, as well as underlying problems that are trauma-informed for our practice with women in the homeless situation. This is certainly true with men, too. So homelessness and children. Homelessness is particularly disorganizing for children. They experience poor health, higher rates of chronic illness like asthma, multiple mental health issues, poor nutrition, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and developmental delays, multiple school transfers, absences from school, lack of quiet space for homework, and chaos of living on streets further impedes progress in grade appropriate learning and access to educational opportunities. This is an important area for social workers to understand, because children are certainly not reaching their fullest potential if they're homeless. Homelessness and veterans. About 9% of homeless adults are veterans, and women only comprise 8% of this group. With all the common issues underlying homelessness, veterans often have the added stress of PTSD, traumatic brain injury, isolation, social isolation, and difficulties adjusting to life after military discharge. Now, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs provides services to those who have been discharged from the military, and they provide an intensive initiatives to combat homelessness to include outreach models. One of my favorite outreach models is literally taking a mobile unit into the community. This is like a Winnebago, going into the community and providing space in which you can do outreach to those who are homeless and give them an opportunity for privacy, for counseling with a social worker, and looking at possible housing solutions in this setting of an outreach setting. And then health care also being provided. There's also services related to employment and other adequate and required supports. The VA also collaborates broadly with the federal, state, and local agencies like employers, housing providers, and community nonprofits to expand employment and affordable housing options for veterans exiting homelessness. Social work response to homelessness and the arrays of system engagement. This is about as broad as it gets. Think of generalist practice and across the all variety of systems that social workers must engage with to deliver the continuum of coordinated services to address the personal effects of homelessness and advocate for social policies as the macro side of this to address the root causes. We as social workers provide direct services to people in shelters, and we look at transitioning programs with outreach services, community mental health, addiction treatment schools, and child welfare and family services agencies. This is a wide array of services for homelessness. At the macro level, we recognize that housing is a human right, and we must advocate for that. And in many communities, homelessness is criminalized, and there is actual obvious violation of human rights of dignity. Making it illegal to sleep in public spaces is one example. And that's the homeless people often find themselves interfacing with law enforcement as a result rather than social services. That is obviously seriously problematic for us as social workers. So let's look at social work and unemployment. Unemployment has consistently been a serious issue, and in 2017, 4.3% of workers in the U.S. experienced unemployment. Now, in times of COVID, it is estimated that the number has nearly doubled. Not quite doubled, but nearly. And chronic and persistent unemployment is expected over the next few years in the post-COVID economy. Some jobs will never come back, and people will need to retrain. The consequences of unemployment, psychological, social, and financial resources are stressed. Work is fundamental to the sense of competence. Self-esteem plummets when there's a loss of job. Depression and other mental health problems often result, including suicide. And you can see why social workers are important interfaces with all of these social and emotional mental health problems. Unemployment policy. Think back to the Social Security Act of 1935 as the unemployment compensation and workers' compensation to secure income for people who are temporarily unemployed fall underneath this act. Today, we have combined state and federal partnership which provides partial wage replacement for people who have lost their jobs. It's important to recognize this is time limited, and when people fall out of this system because they've expended their time limits, they often cease to be counted, and that's one of the issues around counting people who are unemployed. So, services for those who are unemployed. Generalist social work practice informs multiple strategies dealing with problems associated with unemployment. We must confront bias in the commonly held beliefs that unemployed are jobless because something is wrong with them personally. This is the idea that there's something personally fundamentally flawed in a human being that's unemployed. Workers have been dislocated because of job layoffs and industrial plant closures in this age of globalization. People are trying to find work and often find that their skills do not match the technological society. They need education and skill development training to prepare for their new future. Resulting problems include underemployment, and this is actually viewed to be a social class of people working below their skill set and abilities. For real and meaningful services, employee assistance programs are one place in which social workers interface with unemployment. That is, the kinds of services that are available to employees as they're transitioning away from their jobs due to termination, due to layoffs, and the social workers can work in these employee assistance programs to help people transition, identify the kinds of resources that are available for skills retraining and other kinds of supports, including counseling. This is an important area of social worker location for social work services. So let's look at social work and criminal justice. Historically, the criminal justice field has built upon law enforcement as a foundation with an emphasis on criminal behavior and punishment. This poses obvious challenges for social workers oriented to social justice and empowerment. As a result, social workers have played a limited role in adult corrections. However, social workers are more and more involved in the following services: community-based rehabilitation, supports for those convicted in their reintegration to the communities once they serve their time, counseling of prison inmates, social services for families of criminals, and advocacies for victims of crime. Juvenile delinquency is an important area, and social workers have historically been involved with youth and children in conflict with the law. Think back to Jane Addams and the women of Hull House and how they engaged in recognizing that children needed to be treated as children under the law rather than adults. This is an important advocacy aspect of changing the laws and recognizing juvenile delinquency as a unique area. So we need to help minors rather than engage them in punitive responses. Social workers recognize that minors should not be charged with adult crimes. Youth development programming is a critical area to prevent juvenile offenses as well as provide rehabilitative opportunities. You think about youth development program as a preventative area, and this would be youth sports in the community, clubs, youth groups, church engagement, other kinds of places where youth come together for positive and proactive pro-social activities. And this is a preventative approach to juvenile delinquency. It keeps youth engaged in the community and in a productive manner rather than allowing them to fall into a criminal justice situation due to boredom or other problems related to poverty. Punishment or rehabilitation. Retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, and reintegration. These are important concepts to consider. Retribution is quite simply the idea of an eye for an eye, using punishment to get even with the person who's committed the criminal offense. That's a very common approach in society. And then we have deterrence, which is the idea of these really strict and really severe punishments based on the seriousness of the crime, and based on the idea of distributive justice and the punishment fitting the crime with sentencing guidelines but the courts must follow, and that is the judges have very little latitude in making a decision that be more based on social services and what the person needs, and rather must respond in a punitive manner. Rehabilitation is a place where social workers have been really involved in the reformatory movement. Rather than punishment, rehabilitation is offered, and it usually means educational and vocational training is core to this idea. But the offenders are still imprisoned, and those kinds of services are engaged in the prison setting. So for educational services, you might think of somebody completing their GED as part of their rehabilitative plan. Reintegration is designed to assist offenders upon their release from prison to adapt and then reestablish themselves in the community. Halfway houses and other service centers are part of this approach to assist with successful transition from prison to community. So let's look at roles of social workers in criminal justice. We have police social workers, forensic social workers, juvenile court officers, probation and parole officers, and social workers in correctional facilities. We'll look at each one. Police social work. Many community responses by police are related to domestic violence, sexual assault, mental health problems, elder abuse, and other family-oriented problems like child abuse. Some of the police departments have now actually begun to employ social workers to work in tandem with police officers working on the same team. Today there are increased numbers of police departments with 24-hour assistance programs jointly staffed by police and social workers. This is an important model because it starts to look at the real causes of these call-outs to people that are having family-based or mental health-based problems rather than a criminal justice problem. These models have gained considerable attention recently related to the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality as a way to prevent any kinds of police brutality and start to address the root or core problems related to the call-outs. That is quite often mental health or family problems. Forensic social workers. This is usually for seasoned social workers, and they act as expert witnesses. As court witnesses, forensic social workers must use their knowledge and experience to present the facts clearly in a court of law. Avoiding the use of jargon is essential, and accurate records are critical as they are entered into evidence. To prepare for court appearances, social workers must collect all documentation of their case activity, case history records, assessment materials, and for credibility present their resume for professional experience. You can see why seasoned social workers are frequently the ones working in forensic social work, because the work is so meticulous, and you must have expert knowledge in order to present the facts before the court of law. And this is done underneath grounds of testimony, that is sworn in statements, and so it must be really critical to be expert in your field. Juvenile court officers. Social work practitioners employed in juvenile justice settings function in a variety of ways, including performing assessments, attending court hearings, and providing testimony, monitoring cases, and maintaining and analyzing statistical data. Additional social workers often link youth and their families to community-based services, coordinate youth with services, and follow up on a case plan with monitoring and reporting back to court officials. Social workers, with their broad view of the problem of the system, play pivotal roles as members of interdisciplinary juvenile justice teams working side by side with court officers, counselors, guidance officers, and other people in the school setting to work on juvenile justice teams to respond in a comprehensive or holistic manner to the juvenile in the court setting. Probation and parole. Probation is the alternative to prison, and parole is an early release from prison. Court officers are often social workers overseeing these two areas of criminal justice. Social workers often supervise parolees to ascertain that they are following the stipulations of the parole agreements, that is, the court-ordered agreements, in order to be paroled. Social workers working with juveniles and adults prepare social history information to aid in the official decision making. They also provide supervision and casework services to those on probation. Social workers must deal with their dual function of enforcing laws and providing casework services. They work as agents of social control in these settings, and that's a real challenge as we're committed to social justice and empowerment. But the reality is, in this particular aspect of social work practice, social workers are agents of social control. Social workers in correctional facilities. Social workers employed in correctional facilities provide direct services to inmates and serve as liaison to community resources. Within correctional facilities, social work services may be utilized in areas of mental health, substance abuse, education, and vocational rehabilitation. Case coordination skills are also important because of the multifaceted nature of problems, requiring numerous services. Social workers may work with inmates individually as well as small groups, frequently small groups, in order to assist people in making behavioral changes and adapt to prison life by coping with the array of prison problems such as violence, sexual assault, psychological victimization, drug trafficking, and racial strife. Social workers also network with community programs for services needed by inmates and their families, especially as inmates are transitioning back to the community or families need support. Thank you.